Welcome on into the Utah Blockcast. I'm Steve Bartle, Utah Insider for KSL Sports. Man, oh man, I tried recording last night and I could not stop fumbling over my words. So I had to reset, had to take a night, had to get back into the chair this morning, Tuesday morning, to get this recorded. So I appreciate everybody being patient with me and with the Blockcast and all that. But man, I wanted to get behind the mic again just to sort of dive into some of Kyle Whittingham's comments from Big 12 Media Days, just a little bit more than what I did on the last episode. And if you missed that, you can go to your podcast feeds. You can go to YouTube. You can find it at the KSL Sports site on YouTube. If you want to watch the video, you can find it, like I said, on your podcast feeds as well. So, anyways, yeah, I thought I wanted to dive into Kyle Whittingham's thoughts a little bit more. You know, he talked a lot about the big picture of college football and sort of where we're at, as did, most Big 12 coaches. I thought that was sort of the point of emphasis from the Big 12 this year was just kind of the chaos with everything going on in the sport, with rev share being approved, with the circumventing of the supposed rules that have been put in place and guardrails. I think everybody, a lot of people saw a lot of this coming, and I think coaches are being pretty vocal about it because it is becoming quite an issue. So wanted to dive into more of those comments and dive into what's actually going on in terms of what's creating a lot of the frustration. So want to talk about that. And then also, we're 2 weeks away from the beginning of fall camp, Camp Kyle 2025. So that's exciting. And I want to start by getting some position group previews up. And we're going to start with today with Utah's most unsettled group, the wide receiver room, and what sort of needs to happen in fall camp, what we need to see kind of resetting from what we learned of the group in spring ball, and what, like I said, what we need to see from the group moving forward into fall camp. So plenty to get to on today's episode. But first, I want to start with the news yesterday. Kelvin Obot received a pretty significant ratings bump. We'll call it that. And so obviously, big shout out to Kelvin Obot, the Fruitland High School offensive tackle up there in Idaho. I'll probably be traveling to a couple of his games this year to keep tabs on him and all that, which is going to be exciting. I think Utah fans obviously understand the importance and the value of good offensive linemen, and with what we've seen with Spencer Fano and Caleb Lomu, there's plenty of reason to be excited about Obot following in that same path. Following that blueprint that Jim Harding has built with those two. And so I think, I think it's pretty big for Kelvin Obot to get the rating bump that he did. And what I'm referring to is Rivals, which has recently merged with On3. And now, On3 has made such great gains in the industry with, they only established themselves a few years ago under Shannon Terry, who has had his fingerprints all over the industry. He's built essentially each and every big website in the industry. And so those two brands have merged, and they now all fall under the brand, the Rivals brand name. So what we saw was Kelvin Obot named the number 7 overall player in the entire 2026 class. Not just position group, not just offensive tackle, not just regionally or any of that. The number 7 overall player, regardless of position, and he was one of 12 prospects in there to receive their 5-star status in their initial ranking. So this was the first of Rivals' new ranking, sort of like the top 247. Rivals 300 is now going to be their kind of their premium list, their blue chip list, if you will. And Kelvin Obot was one of 12 players to earn a 5-star designation in this initial ranking. So they're going to get to 32 prospects that they name a 5-star prospect, and Kelvin Obot was one of the first 12 to receive that designation. So pretty significant for him, pretty significant for Utah, obviously. With Jim Harding just doing what he does, man, and like I said, he's kind of established a blueprint, and I think it's great that Utah has capitalized on landing, one of the premier prospects in the class to follow in the footsteps of Fano and Lomu. He's going to be a guy that, obviously Utah identified him as an instant impact player well before the well before yesterday. But I think it's good just to kind of get that validation and sort of cement his status, to get other opinions, other evaluations from other people that sort of see the same thing that Utah does. So again, good validation, a good stamp of approval from the industry, or at least from one source in the industry, and so we'll see what happens. But with Obot, he's got all the tools, all the raw qualities that you want in an offensive tackle, and I think for him, he's in a unique situation being up there at Fruitland, where a former Utah great, former NFL great offensive tackle Jordan Gross is his head coach, and I think from what I gathered of in talking to sources about Obot last month, there's a maturity there that I think Utah really appreciates, really values, and I think is something that has been common in the highly rated recruits that Utah has brought in over the years, and guys that have found a lot of success. The Jalen Johnsons, the Clark Phillips, Spencer, Caleb, the guys that genuinely assess the value of the program, the value of the coach in place, and see sort of the path and vision that Utah has for him. And I think Obot has a lot of those qualities that mimic or mirror what those other players had as well. So really encouraging stuff for Utah. Now, it's about keeping him locked in, moving forward, and you can certainly bet that programs like Michigan and Oregon are going to continue to push for him. But I think Obot is pretty locked in, according to somebody I talked to. So another shout out real quick before I get into Kyle Whittingham's comments. Gabe Matson, shout out to him. Great performance Sunday night against the Utah Jazz in the Las Vegas Summer League. Scored 18 first half points in one of his patented heaters that we've seen over the years for the Running Utes. It just got hot. Knocked down 6 to 7 shots from deep, and hit some really impressive shots. And I think for Gabe, Golden State is a great situation to pursue for him in terms of his game. Obviously, we know that Golden State loves shooters. I think their system emphasizes player movement and ball movement, which I also think fits Gabe really well. And I think the hope is that Gabe can land somewhere in the organization there, the G League potentially, and work his way up the ranks essentially. But I think that's an organization that is pretty open-minded, that values what they value, and I think Gabe is in a good situation there. So hopefully he continues that and continues to play well and all that. That's good for Utah basketball for sure. So with that, let's go back to Big 12 Media Days and some of Coach Whittingham's comments from day 2 of Big 12 Media Days. It's interesting. There's a lot of talk about Kyle Whittingham and sort of how he treats the media. But I think in these kind of settings that, Coach Whitt is pretty forthcoming with his opinions. He's pretty honest, sometimes pretty blunt in terms of how he shares opinions on certain subjects. And I think, and after listening to 16 coaches over the 2 days, I think there was a lot of value that Coach Whitt provided. There was a lot of coach speak from other coaches, which is fair. Guys not wanting to step on toes, but I think Coach Whittingham, with where he's at in his career, I think has a really good understanding of where the game is at, has a good understanding of what's on the horizon. As we've seen over the recent years, and how he's called things and received blowback, which proved to be which proved to be erroneous, essentially. I think, and so I just think, Witt, like I said, in these sort of settings, I think he's actually really good, and there's a lot of value in what he provides. So, there was a lot of talk last week about sort of where college football is at and what's wrong with college football. And I think just as a refresher, we're talking largely about the issues that have risen from the revenue sharing, which was approved last month as part of the House versus NCAA settlement, and schools now have been approved to distribute up to 20.5 million to student athletes and divvy up that amount essentially how they see fit. So if they want to commit all 20.5 million to football, they want to split it up pretty evenly between men's and women's sports, that's up to each and every school to determine what they feel is best with that 20.5 million. So, and I think it's also important to note that, and I think most people understand this, that this 20.5 million, this is not an additional source of funds that are coming from the NCAA. This is money that has to be generated by the school itself. And so, that's coming with potential issues and problems for programs that, aren't clearing that sort of revenue to have that 20.5 million. There's been a lot of talk of programs having to adjust their budgets, cut back in other places. Some schools even eliminating sports. We've seen that with Utah, unfortunately. And I think that's kind of the worry with revenue sharing, some of the issues in terms of the impact of this decision, and also what we're seeing is with the approval of the settlement, the Power Four conferences agreed to essentially abide by some of the guardrails and rules that are being put forth by the College Sports Commission, which is a Deloitte-run NIL clearinghouse, and they're primarily tasked with clearing third-party NIL deals, and there have been a number of issues that have arisen from that as well. And so it's just there's a lot of things going on that have created issues, and so I think we heard from a lot of coaches, a lot of frustration from the coaches, and so with that, I want to get to Whittingham's comments on a number of different things. So what you'll see here is Whittingham sharing his thoughts on what he would do to fix college football, the big issues in college football. He's going to talk about collective bargaining and then also potentially other things that could help the game. So let me get to Witt's comments here. Let me add it here.
Biggest issue is we've got to have somewhat of a level playing field with the NIL space. Not, I shouldn't say NIL, but with what we're paying them. Bottom line, they're professionals. They're getting paid like professionals, and we've got to get a handle on that. We can't have X amount of schools spending $50 million on rosters, and the rest of us $12 million. I mean, it doesn't work. I mean, it works, but there's about 12 teams that'll have a chance to win it all every year, and that's it. So I would say level in the playing field with a salary cap, again, back to the NFL model, and making things more uniform. And it works in the NFL, so why can't it work at this level? Yeah, collective bargaining for NFL players is one thing. For college students, it's not quite as, they're not as experienced, they're not as savvy. But I think that you're going to see it eventually, and I think you're going to see. I still believe that super conference concept is on its way. I really buy into that, and I think that. There'll be X amount of teams that break away. They'll have their own conference commissioner, and they'll do things the way they want to do them, and everyone else is going to kind of have to fend for themselves in that way. I don't know if I support or don't support it. I know that the system we have in place is not sustainable, and even with the rev share and the changes that have been made, I'm still not buying the fact that it's the answer. I think that the closer I realize when you say, well, college football is not the NFL, but the NFL has been doing some good things for a lot of years, and we got to take some pages from them on how to implement salary cap, collective bargaining if it comes to that. I think that's the only real way to get a grasp and a handle on things. As distasteful as it might sound to some people, I think an NFL minor league model is the best direction to head. Personally, that's my own opinion. And I don't think the rev share is an equalizer, or is going to be the equalizer that everyone thinks it's going to be, because they're going to circumvent it. They'll find ways around it, just like everyone always has. And so you're still going to see a big disparity in the opportunity to build rosters. But again, until we get to an NFL model where there's a salary cap and that's it, if you break that cap, then you get huge penalties. Huge penalties. Then it's not going to work.
So there's Witt's comments, and I think he was pretty honest with sort of his assessment of where we're at with college football. And I think, just to kind of provide some added detail in terms of what he's talking about here, I think, several coaches complained that, agents and collectives are now guaranteeing third-party deals. I think that's become a big frustration behind the scenes, that programs are guaranteeing these third-party deals as part of their revenue-sharing compensation package that programs are giving. So that's sort of how these programs are circumventing the rules, is they're guaranteeing NIL deals that shouldn't be, essentially shouldn't be approved. And that gets back to the CSC and the, like I said, the College Sports Commission, and what they're tasked with doing is, approving NIL deals and providing feedback of whether certain deals should be approved or not. And yet we're still seeing a lot of issues with what is essentially pay for play. So, that's the sort of circumventing of the guardrails that Coach Whittingham talked about. We're starting to see schools offer, recruits even, not only guaranteed contracts like we saw with Felix Ojo and Texas Tech. He got a 3-year guaranteed deal with the Red Raiders, which was interesting. The initial reports of his contract were so inflated. I got a text almost immediately that was nonsense, that it wasn't accurate. And, some hours later, I think Matt Zenitz of 24/7 Sports reported the actual numbers of that deal, and it was a fraction. I think it was more than half of what the initial reports were. So, he's got a good agent. We'll say that much, but I think even that is causing some issues. And then just, overall, the sentiment is that, there are a few programs in college football that are just pulling so far ahead in terms of the revenue that they have, the funds that they have available, that it's making for an unfair playing field, where, Whittingham talked about it there, that there are going to be 10 to 12 teams that essentially accumulate all of the quality talent in the game. And, it's going to be pretty difficult for other programs to keep pace with those programs that just have the unlimited resources. And so, it's, I think the Big 12, we saw it with Coach Prime. We saw it with, Cincinnati, Arizona State with Kenny Dillingham. We saw a number of coaches allude to the fact that they all want a level playing field. And I think, many Big 12 coaches and administrators stress the need for consistent, transparent regulations. And I think that's sort of what the goal is with all of this, is they just want, they want rule enforcement, essentially. I think it was Brett Yormark who opened with his opening statements, at Big 12 Media Days, that they're working closely with the CSC and are pushing for stronger regulations and punitive actions for rule breakers. And I think that's going to be so important. Whittingham mentioned that they need to be penalties, and they need to be pretty hard penalties for programs that go over a potential salary cap. And I think that's going to be important as well. Essentially, we're talking about the death penalty, the modern version of the death penalty here. So, with the way that SMU is spending money right now, there's a chance that they could become the first program to get the death penalty in the modern age all over again. So it's kind of unique, how we're sort of repeating history. It's a new spin on it and all of that. But I do think, there's definitely a push. And what was, I think, most interesting in terms of, what we heard from coaches and what we've heard from, the academic side is this, it seems like coaches are embracing the fact that these are professional athletes now with the money that they're getting paid. It's time to treat them essentially like employees. And I think though they didn't say it outright, you know, a number of coaches called them professional athletes. And when you think of a professional athlete, you think of him being an employee of an organization. You think of collective bargaining and, players and the organizations themselves bargaining to come to an agreement on rules, on regulations, on calendar schedules, and all of that sort of stuff. And I think you're starting to hear more and more, especially from the coaches, that needs to become a thing, that is essentially what needs to happen in order to provide the necessary guardrails to get the game back to what it was. Because in the end, I think coaches just want to get back to coaching football. I thought Coach Dillingham said it really well. I shouldn't say said it really well, but he said something really interesting, that recruiting is dead, retention is alive. And though it's kind of a weird thing because recruiting is still important, I do think that coaches are sort of dying for retention to become the focus again. And they just want to be able to build their rosters, build their programs the way that they used to, and to have the regulations in place that will allow them to have a firmer grasp on their roster. I think there's just so much going on with the sport that it's creating a lot of frustrations. You've got guys that sign deals with certain programs, and 2 weeks later they're entering the transfer portal because somebody worked around and tampered with the player through their agent or through a buddy of theirs or through a parent, and didn't contact the player directly, but they're still sending a message to the player influencing him to enter the transfer portal, which is tampering. And so I think there's just so much where people just want to take a breath. Like, it just feels like coaches haven't been able to take a breath, a sigh of relief, that our roster construction, we can rest a little bit. We can take a break from it. I think you're starting to feel more and more of that anxiety and frustration boil to the top with everything. And look, when they're in the heat of it, coaches are definitely more and more willing to speak their mind. You're seeing that across the country. But I think just in general, the temperature on all of this is really starting to get to a point where it's, in terms of the health of the game, we're getting to a make it or break it type of situation. So I do think ultimately that Coach Witt is right. And this is something that, plenty of people have talked about, that the only real way to provide the rules and regulations and penalties is to collectively bargain. And I think that's going to be a major talking point over the next little while for coaches. And if we start to hear administrators talk about that, that's when I start to really buy into this becoming a thing. But I do think the coach is pounding the table for it. I think ultimately we're going to get there. And Coach Whittingham, I'm with him as well, that eventually we're going to see a super conference where essentially it's a minor league, where it breaks off from the academic connection of the NCAA. Players won't have to go to school anymore. They're just going to be essentially professional athletes, minor league athletes to the NFL. And I think, there's certainly an appetite, on Utah's end to be included in that still, a very strong appetite, in fact. But we'll see. Obviously, we're learning that, there's a lot that goes into it. So we'll see. But anyways, I just thought it was fascinating hearing from Coach Witt on that topic, and wanted to go a little bit more in depth on, sort of the details behind what's going on. And I do think, that we'll get there eventually, one way or another. Maybe, I don't know. Actually, I don't know that we will, but we can hope. So yeah, there's just, with everything going on, there's not a lot of romanticism with the sport of college football. Everyone knows, where we're essentially barreling toward a paid to play um, wilderness, model uh, arena. Like this is where the game is headed, where it essentially is, pay for play. And, we don't have to hide behind that. We turn it into a professional model. I think like that is ultimately where this ends up. And, we'll see. But I think it needs to happen soon because a lot of people are growing frustrated, you know, in the industry and from a fan perspective. There's just a lot of frustration and people's patience is certainly dwindling thin, and so yeah, I think we're gonna get to that point where it's make it or break it. So we'll see. But let's change gears. Let's get to fall camp because that was turning into more and more of a downer and downer. But this 2025 season I think is a real opportunity for Utah. I shouldn't say real opportunity, but I do think there's a lot of optimism for Utah football going into 2025, which it feels good to say that considering what we went through last year in 2024, a 5-7 season, a 7-game losing streak, obviously all the injury issues and all that came with that. I just think, last year was so frustrating in a number of different ways that, to be here July 15th, couple days removed from Big 12 Media Days, and just sort of seeing the vibe coming from Utah football, the people that have talked about Utah football at Big 12 Media Days. There's a lot of optimism for this team in particular. There's a lot of excitement for Devin Dampier, and so it's certainly exciting from that perspective. Once we get into the season and we start playing games, I think that'll be good for everybody because I do think Utah has a chance to really compete this year in the Big 12 and really contend at the top of the conference. Obviously, there are certain keys for Utah to achieve that. But with fall camp, kicking off in 2 weeks, it's a good time to start our position group previews and all that. So, like I said, wanted to start today with Utah's most unsettled position group, the wide receiver position. And so let's go back to spring ball, kind of reset there, what happened there and where we're at right now. And just to start with the passing game in and of itself, I thought, in terms of dynamics and elements of the game, there was no other dynamic that improved as much as the passing game did during spring ball. And I say that to say that the first 2 weeks were really rough for Devin Dampier and the wide receivers in the passing game in particular. But the progress they made, over the span of those 5 weeks, but over the last 2 weeks of spring ball, it was clear that chemistry was established and the passing game looked pretty effective. So, there was a lot of encouraging things going on. There were players that were consistently making plays. There were certain elements of the passing game that seemed pretty consistent, that seemed pretty effective. And I think there were just a lot of encouraging signs by the end of spring ball. It was on a good trajectory. And then, coming out of spring ball after the spring game and all of that, obviously the transfer portal opened and unfortunately Zacharias Williams entered the transfer portal. He was a guy that I think Utah was fending off a number of programs. Arizona State, UCLA were certainly programs that I've heard linked to him, but he ends up at USC, and so that was a tough loss because according to Whittingham, he emerged as wide receiver 1 for Utah. So that's tough to lose that. But beyond the departure of Zacharias Williams, I think there were a number of other positive developments individually that I think Utah can build with moving forward. And to start, I thought Dadron Zipperer, he missed time during spring ball with bumps and bruises and that sort of thing. I don't know exactly what type of injuries, but he just missed time. But when he was on the field, he was consistently making plays. And I think there's reason to be optimistic for Dadron Zipperer. But I'll have more on him in just a bit. Beyond him, there were good things from Ryan Davis and Creed Whittemore, two guys that I think can play sort of a similar role, kind of a reliable slot guy that can either create yardage after the catch. I think that's more Whittemore's game. He's more of that ball in hand playmaker, whereas Ryan Davis, he's kind of your Wes Welker type, really solid route runner. Doesn't have great size, doesn't have elite athleticism, but he's really technically sound. He's got chemistry with Devin Dampier. We didn't see a whole lot of him through spring ball, but he was the guy kind of carrying the group through those first 2 weeks and looked really productive. So, those two guys are going to be key cogs for this wide receiver room. And then a couple other guys that I thought made plays here and there. Justin Stevenson, I sort of viewed him as an important vertical option, and he did make plays as a vertical threat. Just need to see more consistency from him. And I think the thing with him is it's important to remember, he's going to be a sophomore this year, so he's still young. He had some production to his name at Wyoming, but he was just a redshirt freshman last year. So, it's going to take time for him to. He's still a guy that's young and developing, but I think if he can take a good step forward in fall camp, I think that'll be really good. And then another guy, Mana Carvalho, I thought was really dynamic. Another slot guy that really good with the ball in his hands. Just a dynamic athlete that can create, make guys miss. He'll remind a lot of folks of Britton Covey, given the size and the athletic qualities that he has. So I think there's certainly individual pieces that Utah has in this group that they can move forward with. But ultimately, we exited spring ball with significant questions revolving around this group. And while the addition of I think they brought in 5 transfers, or I should say they brought in 4 transfers and then 1 freshman in Carvalho in January. We saw good things from all of those guys. That includes Otto Tia in this group, but more on him in a bit. It was clear that Utah needed help, and so they go into the spring portal, and they make 2 additions with Tobias Merriweather and Larry Simmons. And I think these guys are going to be important. And so as we get into fall camp now, and looking ahead, I've got 3 keys for the wide receiver room, and it starts with those spring portal additions, and with Tobias Merriweather and Larry Simmons. At least one of those guys has to emerge as a go-to option, right? So Utah needs a wide receiver one, more specifically and more just detailed, I should say. They need an outside receiving threat to emerge. They've got guys that can catch passes, that can make plays in the slot. They have a number of options there, but they need threats on the outside, guys that sort of have gravity, pull to the outside. And I think if they can get that from at least one of those guys, that'll be pretty significant for this offense. In order for this offense to reach its ceiling, they need these guys to emerge as viable threats, and for them to force defenses to respect their presence on the field. I think that's going to be the key. With this offense, there's obviously a big emphasis on the running game. That's going to create a lot of play action opportunities, and pretty favorable situations for these guys. And so, these two have to get into fall camp, and they have to take advantage of those opportunities in camp against this Utah defense. Utah would love to have one become a true go-to receiver, a guy that when you're 3rd and 7, he can run a route that you need him to run, and he can execute it, and you can go to him, and you can make those 3rd and long conversions. Utah needs one of these guys to emerge, ideally as that sort of receiver. But at the very least, they have to prove that they are, legitimate outside receiving threats that can stretch the field, that can provide that vertical threat, and provide the sort of honest approach, for opposing defenses, that they have to respect the over-the-top passing game, because that'll do so much for this running game, and I think that's important. So key number 1, perhaps the biggest key of the entire team, across the roster, is these guys have to emerge as options, as legitimate threats. So that's key number one. Key number two, Adrian Zipper's development. I think this is kind of an X factor type of kind of thing for him. When he's on the field, he's made plays, and that goes back to even the year before. But his big issue has been, the bumps and bruises have kept him off the field a little bit too much. He's a pretty slight build. He's really lean. He'll remind people of Money Parks in terms of his size and his physical build, but Zipper desperately needs to have put on some mass since spring ball, because he can be an option in this passing game. He can be sort of an important piece in this receiving corps if he's got the mass to handle the physicality of the Big 12 conference. So that's going to be the key for me, is how much physical development Zipper has made. If he's made a good amount of progress in that sense, I think we can sort of start to look at him as potentially, a pretty consistent option in this passing game. But that's going to be sort of the key, is how much progress has he made in that sense, and what sort of impact does that have on him, with his game. So I think that's going to be another big key, is Adrian Zipper's development, most specifically his physical development. And then the last key for me is gaining clarity between the receiver and tight end position. So currently, there's a handful of guys that are kind of in between positions. I shouldn't say a handful of guys. There's, I think, three guys. Otto Tia has obviously been talked about as him having made the move to tight end. And, according to people that I've talked to, that is indeed the case, that he's going to play tight end this season as sort of that, landing king, H-back type of option. He was a guy that, where Landon King struggled to gain the weight, Otto Tia has struggled to maintain his weight, to keep his weight down. And so I think Utah's just embraced that with him, and he's got a big frame, he's got a big build, the sort that I think mimics what you want in sort of that hybrid type of tight end. So first, figuring out what you've got in Otto Tia as he makes this transition to sort of that hybrid tight end role. But then you've also got other guys that have also flirted with the move to tight end. I've heard Luca Caldarella was potentially on the move to the tight end position. It sounds like he's going to stick at wide receiver. And then J.J. Buchanan, who was going to come into the program as a wide receiver, it sounds like he's also going to be in that tight end position. So I think, for Jason Beck, this is important, not just, gaining clarity between the two positions in terms of what it means for the depth chart and, how much depth do you have at these two positions. But it's important for Beck to figure out what these guys are going to be good at in these roles, and what it opens up for the wide receiver position. So this is sort of a 2-for-1. I'm hitting on two position groups here, but I think it's important for Jason Beck to gain clarity on what these guys bring to the table, because it's going to impact what he does with the rest of the receiver room. So figuring out, what these guys' strengths are at the tight end position, what sort of routes they're comfortable with, and what sort of elements they can add to the passing game in that position, and really determining whether tight end is actually going to work still. So all of that stuff is important for this wide receiver room. So for me, again, the three keys: Tobias Merriweather or Larry Simmons. They have to be guys that emerge for Utah this season and in fall camp. Adrian Zipper, his development, again, when he's on the field, he's a pretty consistent producer in the passing game. He's a guy that can get to the intermediate and deeper parts of the field with his athleticism, that I think is going to be important for this offense. But he's got to physically develop in order to handle the physicality and stay on the field. And then again, getting clarity between the tight end and receiver position and how that's going to impact the passing game. So, I think in terms of this group, I think, this offense, and with Devin Dampier and Jason Beck, I do think there are enough easy buttons in this offense that there will be production. There will be consistent production in the passing game. We saw it in the spring game that, this offense can generate 8, 9, 10 yards a pop with some of these athletes that they have in the slot with Creed Whittemore, Manna Carvalho, Ryan Davis. That's going to be a consistent thing that they can go to. But then you can't just rely on that as your source of production, right? You can't rely on ball in hand playmaking as your bread and butter. You have to have those guys that can get deep, that can get to the intermediate areas of the field. You have to have that as a threat to maintain that space in order to allow those slot receivers the ability and freedom to create around the line of scrimmage. So that's going to be important for this offense, is finding those threats in the deeper parts of the passing game. That's going to be the biggest key for me, which again gets to back to Larry Simmons and Tobias Merriweather. And in talking to folks and I think it's going to be really interesting to see who emerges. And I think there's a lot of optimism for guys, and I think one name that I'm going to be keeping a close eye on. Hopefully we get to watch fall camp practices. I don't know yet if we will, but Larry Simmons is a guy that I'm really interested in. Obviously, Tobias Merriweather, I've talked a lot about him being sort of the guy that, he's got the ceiling in terms of the trade-off from Zacharias Williams to Tobias Merriweather, right? You're trading a guy with a higher floor in Zacharias Williams to somebody that, he's dealt with injuries, but he's got all of the elite qualities that you want in a true wide receiver one. I think there's a lot of hope that Merriweather can be that truly dynamic wide receiver one type, but I'm really interested to see what Larry Simmons brings to the table. Can he be a 1B? Can he be not even a Robin, but another Batman on the other side of the field? That's something that I'm really interested in. So, man, it's going to be exciting. Going to talk more position groups over the next 2 weeks and previewing each one. Sooner than later, fall camp is going to be here. And then before you know it, we're going to be down in Pasadena for Utah versus UCLA August 30th. It's going to be exciting. The season kickoff, season opener down there in Pasadena. Going to be a lot of fun. Man, I'm excited. I'm fired up. So, going to put a bow on this one. Going to call it a show. Thankfully, I got through it. I sounded somewhat coherent, more so than I did last night recording this thing. So I'm again appreciative to all the people that listen to the Blockcast, that support the Blockcast, that watch it on YouTube. That's been a lot of fun to grow on that platform as well. There's going to be a lot more coming from the Blockcast this year. I'm excited for sort of the plans that I and KSL Sports have for the show, and really excited for what's to come. So more to come from me on that front, more to come from the Blockcast, and yeah, should be exciting, man. 2 weeks away from fall camp beginning. Looking forward to it. This has been the Utah Blockcast. This has been I'm Steve Bartle. I am still Steve Bartle, and I am signing off.